Okay. Are- okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carmen Walker. I'm Associate Professor of Government in the Department of History and Government here at Bowie State University. I want to thank you so much for taking time to join us for our first virtual celebration of Women's History Month. Historically, our department, the Department of History and Government, has used this month to engage in scholarly discussions about the historical and contemporary issues shaping women's lives. I know as a political scientist, we're looking at these issues both inside the electoral arena and outside the electoral arena, and looking at the politics of history and how we are represented. And that is what we're doing today. Even as we recognized International Women's Day on March 8th, I was reminded of the challenges women of color and in particular, Black women, the challenges we face in shifting the ways in which our voices are centered or marginal, are centered, and even the way in which our experiences are acknowledged and presented. And so today's discussion on Black women's historical efforts is really meaningful, and particularly meaningful as we recognize over 15 years of our women's studies program here at Bowie State University. And Dr. Watkins, who I'll be presenting later, is certainly, we really are in gratitude for you, because without your efforts, we would not have that program here and we wouldn't be celebrating today. And so with that, I'm going to turn we have a few things that are going to take place here. We're going to have Dina Kwa, who is going to give remarks, and then Dina Kwa is going to be followed by Dr. Brown, Tamara Brown, who is the director of our Women's Studies program here. And then we'll have the introduction of our speaker. And then we will also have Dr. Watkins, who will be presenting. So again, thank you so much. And I'm turning the screen or microphone over to Dina Kwa. Thank you so much, Dina Kwa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walker. From the first settlers who came to our shores, from the first African Indian families who befriended them, men and women have worked together to build this nation. Too often the women were unsung, and sometimes their contributions were unnoticed. But the achievements, leadership, courage, strength, and love of the women who built America was as vital as that of the men whose names we know so well. Some of you may know this famous quote, and that was by President Jimmy Carter. That was a message that he gave to the nation as he established the National Women's History Week in 1980, March 2 to March 8th. And since then, achievements of women in America have changed the historical landscape very dramatically. I'm not going to go through the list because we have some people who are much more qualified to speak about this. For example, in 1975, we had fewer than 45% of women who were moms working. Now we have 71% of moms with kids under 18 who are in the workforce. We have 17% of the congressional population currently occupied by women, and we have 18% in the Senate. And I could just cite a few more examples. For example, 14% of active members in the US Armed Forces today are women. And that is up from 1950, only when 2% were women. And now 60% of college degrees are awarded in the US every year to women. That is a remarkable achievement. So there is a lot for us to celebrate. And I'm very happy that History and Government has thought it fit to celebrate women in this very special way. And I commend the women's, the minor program that you have in the women's program as well. For how many years? I did 19 years. Is it 19 years? Well, for quite a while that you've been in place and you've done a good job. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Valethia Watkins to take the microphone and really enlighten us about how standing in our own truth, Black women and the politics of women's studies, is shaping, Bowie State is shaping the country and is shaping the world. So welcome to Bowie State, welcome to the Department of History and Government, and thank you so much for the outstanding work that you do, shaping the lives of the youth, because the youth are the ones who are going to take the place of we, the older ones, and really continue to shape the landscape, the historical landscape. So again, thank you so much once again for inviting me to bring this welcome. And I'm looking forward to the remarks from Dr. Watkins. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dina Kwa. I'm Dr. Tamara Brown. I am a professor of history and director of the Women's Studies program, thanks to Dr. Valethia Watkins, here at Bowie State University, literally thanks to her. And so it's my pleasure to give the occasion for her address today. Mariah Stewart, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Mary Church Terrell, Mary McLeod Bethune, Anna Julia Cooper. These are names that have often been lost to history, but they share a double oppression, being female and Black. They triumphed, however, in spite of their gender and their race. We often point to the beginnings of the women's movement, as they like to call it, with Seneca Falls and the convention that was held there in 1848. Very few men were invited, but Frederick Douglass was one of them because he supported both abolition and also the rights of women. At that first convention, with the women presiding, their voices were very low. And this is because they were not used to speaking in public a lot. And so they had this declaration of sentiments where they stated some of the things that they felt were needed in order for women in general to become full citizens of the United States, and sharing with the citizenship rights that men were able to share, white men in particular. As they went down this list of items, one of the things that they said was the right to vote. And again, it was barely above a whisper, so that people probably were like, what did she say? Yes, the right to vote. And we know, especially here in 2021, how important that is, and that our vote is our voice. Black women in the past election helped to propel the United States into new political truth. We have a female, Black, Asian, American, walking the halls of political heights with Kamala Harris as the vice president. And we do celebrate that. We also celebrate the fact that we have a women's studies program here at Bowie State University. And these efforts were because of people like Valethia Watkins and Carmen Walker, okay, who does not always take credit where credit is due. And so that's why I was so happy that we were going to have this program, this Women's History Month. The University of Maryland over the summer announced that they were the first institution, I think is what they said, to offer a minor in Black Women's Studies. And I read that, and while I celebrated that, and I said, oh, that's really, really nice, and that's good. I said, but wait a minute, Bowie State University, I know our focus here definitely is Black Women's Studies by the classes that we offer and the focus of what we teach. I said, perhaps they're not the only one. And since they're just offering it over the past summer when they're announcing it, perhaps they're not the first. Here at Bowie, we don't often celebrate some of the path-breaking things that we do. We are not just the oldest HBCU in Maryland, we are the 4th oldest in the nation. And so I do want to celebrate this program that 2 of our panelists helped to come to fruition today. And I'm happy to be a part of it. And literally, I owe my profession to it. So thank you so much. Sojourner Truth proclaimed in her Aren't I a Woman speech that she shared the ongoing struggle of the women's movement in attaining rights that were denied her because of her gender. The women that she supported, however, did not necessarily recognize her struggle as a Black female and all that it entailed. It appeared for much of our history that the term woman only applied to white women. Women's History Month is the outgrowth of the struggle for women's suffrage and workers' rights in the United States and women's activism globally. On the heels of the movement for women's liberation in the 1970s, the United Nations started to recognize March 8th as International Women's Day. The National Women's History Project successfully lobbied Congress to implement Women's History Week in 1981, and this was to be celebrated around the time of March 8th, and by 1987, Women's History Week became Women's History Month. We celebrate and march to commemorate women of the past, recognize women of the present, and pave the way for women of the future. Now I turn the program back over to Dr. Walker and await the illuminating remarks that I'm sure Dr. Watkins will give us today. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for the occasion and the wonderful remarks. Yes, I'm going to introduce Dr. Watkins, and my history with Dr. Watkins goes back. We have a history that goes back to graduate school, at least, graduate school at Clark Atlanta University, and searching for, other theories to help understand Black women's experiences and stories outside of feminism. And that led to my encounters and independent study work with Dr. Watkins. And lo and behold, we would meet years later again on the campus of Bowie State University. So just wanted to share that tidbit. And let me just share with you some things about Dr. Watkins' background here. Dr. Watkins is currently Associate Professor of Africana Studies and Director of Women's Studies, of the Women's Studies Graduate Certificate Program at Howard University. She holds a Ph.D. in African American Studies from Temple University and a law degree from The Ohio State University, College of Law. Go ahead. She was a member of the team of academics and educators who designed the curriculum framework for Philadelphia's mandatory high school African American history course. These materials are the first approach to African American history using Africana Studies methodology. Previously, Dr. Watkins served as the former National Secretary for the Association of Black Women Historians. She also has served as co-instructor for a department study abroad course in Egypt numerous times. Her research interest includes Black women's intellectual history, the politics of race and racism in American feminist thought, and conceptualizing Africana study approaches to the study of gender. This is only some of her publications. Her publications have appeared in the African American Studies Reader, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, Phylon, the Clark Atlanta University Review of Race and Culture Journal, the African Journal of Rhetoric, and the Compass, among many other places. In addition, she has written several book chapters. Most notable are 2 groundbreaking essays, New Directions in Black Women's Studies and Africana Gender Studies, Theorizing Gender Without Feminism. Professor Watkins has represented Howard University in a wide range of print and media, including local radio outlets such as NBC News, Howard's WHUR, WPFW, WTOP, and the Washington Informer. Dr. Watkins has presented on Black women's history, Africana gender studies, and the racial politics of the women's suffrage and feminist movements across the United States and internationally in countries such as Ghana, Egypt, England, and many other places. And this is only a selection of her accomplishments. So I am just so pleased right now and honored to say, welcome, Dr. Watkins. It is so good to see you, and I'm turning the mic over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to say I am so excited to be here, to have this opportunity to come back, at least virtually, if not physically, to Bowie State University. I have nothing but fond memories of my time at Bowie State University. And so I want to thank everybody who played an instrumental role in bringing this program together, the hard work that it took to bring it about. I want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Brown and Dr. Walker, specifically for carrying on that program so strongly. I hear nothing but wonderful things, and it is such a beautiful opportunity for students at Bowie State University to I really urge you to take advantage of the Women's Studies program there. You have some fantastic scholars, and so you will really enrich your education to go forth and learn as much as you can about the women in our history and about the field of women's studies. So I want to thank the Department of History and Government, particularly Dr. Miller, my former colleague, and Dr. Robertson, the current chair, and everybody, the entire department that really played a role in bringing about this program, but in carrying on the work that you're carrying on. So it is really indeed a special honor and a privilege to have this conversation with you all today. So our topic today is standing in our own truth, Black women in the politics of women's studies. And what I want to do as we initiate this conversation this afternoon is share with you some ongoing dialogue that I've been having with colleagues here at Howard University in terms of my women's studies courses, and then in terms of the community organizations that I'm involved in, particularly ASCAC, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, and others. And this is, so we'll get a chance hopefully to have a dialogue in the near future with questions to continue this conversation. So let me move to the next slide. So in 1895, you have before you the image of Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. And Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin called together Black women for the first National Convention of Black Club Women. And we met, I was there in spirit, we met in Boston in 1895, and she addressed the women who had gathered, giving them the charge or an overview as to why it was so important that they come together. In addition, what comes out of that meeting is a call for the creation of a national organization, which is going to happen the following year in 1896 with the formation of the National Association of Colored Women. But this is an excerpt from that address that she made to the women, and I want to share with you today as a framework for our conversation. She says, our movement is a woman's movement in that it is led and directed by women of the race for the good of women and men. We ask the active interest of our men. We are not alienating or withdrawing. We are only coming to the front, willing to join with any others in the same work. So this statement points to the fact that there is a different tradition, a different women's movement than the one that we normally reference when we say the women's movement, as if there's only a singular or has only been a singular women's movement. And I think it's very important that she is acknowledging that we as in Black women are forming our own movement in our own image and in our own interest. And she's making a very notable distinction between what the other women's movement is doing. And key features of that distinction, which is pointing to a different orientation, is the fact that she is not purging men from the movement, that they're going to be in partnership in advancing these issues. And then if you read further into that chart, you're going to see that they're going to articulate a broader conceptualization of issues that Black women are concerned with, that go beyond the kind of narrow scope that is normally associated with what is a women's issue, that they're concerned with segregation, they're concerned with lynching, they're concerned with what is traditionally called race issues, they're concerned with gender issues. So this is a very important formulation of a different orientation and a different tradition that is often not highlighted or framed in the way that it should be framed. So to give you my conclusion before we get into the meat of the discussion, I want to share with you 3 fast facts. A movement to make feminism compulsory has colonized women's studies. It is often an unacknowledged but very systematic movement within American gender discourses to make the concept of feminism a compulsory interpretive framework or explanatory lens through which to make sense of gender and gender issues. And in this way, compulsory feminism has colonized women's studies. Fact 2, we must decolonize women's studies in order to stand in our own truth as Black women's study scholars and as Black women. Because when we center Black women, then the narrative change. We will bring different assumptions, different questions, different frameworks, and different ideals, because the context in which we struggle is very, very different. And often the cookie cutter approach that is represented by the traditional women's studies approach to these issues treat women's gender as interchangeable and the same, and they're centering and privileging one group of women. And what they're calling Black women's studies is really the study of applying white female experiences as the only authentic and legitimate way to understand gender and women. And so what they're doing is centering their experiences, white female experiences, and measuring how close or how much Black women conform or deviate from their experiences. And that leads to the routine misinterpretation and misrepresentation about our history. What I would say ultimately is gender miseducation. And then the third fast fact I want to share with you this afternoon is that within Black women's studies as a field, there's a common conversation about, are you a womanist or are you a feminist? And this womanist versus feminist binary choice is a false choice that does not represent the full range of possibilities that exist for using different frameworks and perspectives for analyzing or determining how research is done and formulated about Black women. Patricia Hill Collins wrote an article. You know, Patricia Hill Collins, one of the best known Black feminist scholars. She has an article from 1996 called What's in a Name, Womanism and Black Feminism. One of the key points that I want to pull from that article is the fact that she is making the argument that women's studies as a field, or this conversation of Black gender studies, has not done an adequate job. Well, that's really my analysis. Has not done an adequate job in accommodating political differences. It's our collective analysis in that sense. So when she talks about the fact, the current debate of whether to name a Black women's standpoint as either womanist or feminist reflects the basic challenge of accommodating diversity among Black women, it really speaks to this fact that this range of perspective have been erased, and people pretty much have reduced the conversation to either you're a womanist or a feminist. But this debate has serious implications, because there's a question of not only whether you're personally identifying with either one, but that collective intellectual history and tradition, that collective tradition of activism is also at the center of this debate about whether to name it as womanist or feminist or Black feminist. And that becomes problematic in the sense that, once again, that is not the full range of possibility. And that tradition of that intellectual history and that history of activism is the collective property. And so we have been misdirected in trying to find what is the official, the legitimate Black women's perspective. But Black women, like all women or all people, are going to have diverse political commitments, diverse political perspective. And so the field of Black women's studies has to do a much better job in accommodating the diverse opinions and perspectives that should be in conversation with each other, and all should have a seat at the table. And the fact that people have been looking for the one, the only, the official has been a false choice. Within Africana Studies, as we grapple with how we're going to do Black women's studies within the context of Africana Studies, there have been ongoing conversations on how to develop a Africana specific approach and orientation to women. But a part of that conversation has been the need to name what it is that we are doing, because often what has happened over the long arc of the history of this dialogue about feminism and womanism is that those who did not identify with either of those specific perspectives were rendered invisible, were rendered erased from the conversation. And so in conversation with my colleagues, the construct of non-aligned has come forth. Non-aligned is a collective name designed to give representation and visibility to those who choose not to define themselves as feminists. Non-aligned, the invisible majority opposes the system of patriarchy and the system of sexism. They support gender equality without equivocation. And they believe a person can fight for gender justice without feminism. A person does not have to become a feminist or does not automatically become a feminist if they stand up for women and gender equality and fight against sexism. And so non-aligned is a perspective that's grounded in African history and culture, and it contends that feminists do not have a monopoly on caring about women or women's issues. Vivian Gordon, now ancestor, who wrote a book in the middle of this conversation and debate called Black Women, Feminism, and Black Liberation, Which Way? In one of her articles that appears in the book Out of the Revolution, talking about the field of Africana Studies, she has this statement: clearly, overt resistance to the term feminism by so many African American women is not their misunderstanding of the definition of that term in common usage. Rather, it is an important statement of identity and politics. And that is a critical distinction. So within this dynamic, and you go back to that fast fact, and I said there is a quiet movement hidden in plain sight, a movement hidden in plain sight to make feminism compulsory frame of reference or way of making sense of gender and women's issue. There are three strategic ways or three strategies that are used to accomplish this. And the three strategies, there are more than three strategies, but I'm going to share three with you today. The three strategies include a rigged definition of the construct of feminism, the notion of de facto feminism, and then what I refer to as the Black Feminist Revisionist History Project. Let me get to the second one first. The notion of de facto feminism. I translate that often to this notion in colloquial terms as grandma was a feminist, when grandma didn't self-identify as a feminist. So in the literature, you see this in one effort to make feminism compulsory. You see this kind of colonization of certain characteristics, certain traits that are strong and positive. So you may have heard people say, well, my grandmother was a strong, powerful, outspoken woman who was very resourceful, who didn't take anything off of anybody. She didn't call herself a feminist, but she was a feminist. That notion that she didn't self-identify as a feminist, that it gives somebody external a right to impose that, is this notion that feminists have a monopoly over these characteristics of Black, strong, confident, resourceful, powerful, empowered woman. When in fact that no one particular ideological perspective can have ownership over those kinds of characteristics. So what is compulsory feminism? It's designed to take away choice, to override rejection and negate resistance to calling oneself a feminist or using a feminist approach to understand or make sense of gender issues. And it renders moot the question of whether or not a person, or attempts to render moot whether or not a person chooses to identify as feminist. So one of the first strategies and the central core strategy of compulsory feminism is the rigged definition. So many of you have seen this common definition. A feminist is a person who believes in the social and political and economic equality of the sexes. It's sometimes referred to as a dictionary definition of feminism. Some of you may have seen it. It is kind of a popular definition you'll see on social media in certain popular artists' music, certain YouTube, TED Talks. You've seen this definition. It is the one centered in Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk. So in that respect, this definition is rigged in a sense that subscribing to the belief in the political and economic equality of the sexes does not necessarily or automatically translate into using a feminist approach or a feminist framework for pursuing that. So if that is the case, then this definition is an improper litmus test, because one can believe in the equality of the sexes, gender equality, without using a feminist approach to pursue that. So we have to make a separation or a distinction. On the one hand, you have the pursuit of that political goal, and on the other hand, you have an approach. Feminism represents one approach to pursuing, trying to go about and achieving the social and political equality of the sexes. But it's just one approach of many possibilities. And so you do not automatically or have to be a feminist to pursue that goal. And so that is how feminists try to monopolize this ideal and treat this goal as if it is their intellectual property. So by way of analogy, if I use the definition to say, if you believe in God, then that makes you a Catholic, people could see that that would be a very problematic definition. And it's not that people who are of the Catholic faith don't believe in God. Of course they do. But it's also a recognition of the fact that there are some ideals that cannot be the ownership of the sole property of one particular group of people. So that there are many different communities of faith that believe in God, whether you're Baptist, Methodist, et cetera, and so on. And so they believe in God. The Catholics believe in God. So no one group can say, if you believe in God, then you are a member of my group. So there are certain ideals, as I say, that believe to human beings collectively. And likewise, by way of analogy, I will have that same issue with the saying that if you believe in feminism, if you believe in gender equality, that makes you a feminist. So don't look in a dictionary for your definition of feminism, because you will find often a false and misleading definition, which tries to make feminism compulsory. And it's unfair to non-aligned women and women of diverse perspective. And so a proper definition of feminism should begin with the question, what is unique about feminism? What is unique to feminism? And so that ideal is not unique. It is what is unique to them is how they approach that men versus women framework that they use, where they conceptualize men and women as two separate adversarial groups, not on the same side, pitted against each other, always in conflict, always in competition and in rivalry. That is part of what is unique to their perspective. Clenora Hudson Weems, one of the leading advocates of Africana womanism, makes the argument confronting a system of patriarchy that oppresses women in general is a concern for all people, and thus addressing gender problems in our society does not necessarily translate into feminism. And so the point being that power is the ability to define reality. And so we have the power to define our terms of engagement of these issues. And so when we talk about addressing patriarchy and destroying and dismantling patriarchy, for Black people, that's not just women's work, that Black men have a role in fighting that system. The third way that is used to make feminism compulsory is what I would term the Black Feminist Revisionist History Project. And that is the indiscriminate and arbitrary practice of reclassifying historically significant women in our history, often posthumously, as feminists. And so you'll pick up, there's been a proliferation of texts, books, articles that'll name every Black woman who was against being abused or against sexual violence or anything constructive for women. There is just this big catch-all impulse to just label them all indiscriminately as feminists. So people will say Ida B. Wells was a feminist. They'll claim Ella Baker was a feminist. They'll claim a whole range of women. Fannie Lou Hamer was a feminist. And so the problem with that is that often when we look at the historical record, we don't find evidence that these women identified themselves in that way. And we don't find a clear and consistent criteria for applying that label to them. And then on the other side, when you look at the fact that people say that there are so many brands and versions of feminism, and the fact that feminism has been a controversial and has had a contentious relationship with Black women, and then it just becomes problematic to just slap that label arbitrarily on women, Black women. So there are many Black women who were against abuse, sexual violence, who were pro-equality, pro-Black women's rights. But that history of, that long history of a contentious relationship between Black women and feminism means that label cannot be the default position, that it takes more. So let's look at the mission of the Revisionist History Project. The mission, it's a battle for hearts and minds. It is a backdoor appeal where overt appeals have not worked. So you've had a long history of, yes, there have been some Black women who've embraced it, but there are many groups of Black women that have been unrepresented, whose voices have been censored or silence within the discourses of gender because of the politics of citation and the refusal of those who have allegiance to feminism to treat as co-equal the contribution and the voices of those who equally have a commitment to destroying sexism, but who choose a different approach on how to achieve that. So the Black Feminist Revisionist History Project has been the colonization of information or history of Black women. By labeling these Black women as as feminists, it becomes a way to appeal to young women in an attempt to win them over by saying, even though that term may be contentious and problematic in your present day, look at the past, and if it was good enough for Ella Baker, if it was good enough for Fannie Lou Hamer, if it was good enough for Ida B. Wells, then feminism should be good enough for you. So it's flipping these women and trying to turn them into icons of feminism and giving young people the impression that if they adopt a feminist approach, they're walking in the footsteps of their ancestors. Many of these ancestors, again, when they were aware of a clear definition of feminism or aware of that movement, did not choose to define themselves in that way. And again, you have to make a separation between the belief or fighting for the right to vote or fighting for women, and then the approach one uses to fight for women. And feminism represents one approach. So when I say they are rejecting labeling themselves as feminists, they are rejecting subscribing to that particular approach, but it's not that they're rejecting fighting for those issues. They care about those issues. And so that celebrity endorsement works from it works like a celebrity endorsement. I'm saying these are very important figures, beloved figures in our history who function the same way celebrity endorsement of products today win over people to catch their attention to want to buy products. This is in this way, feminism is a product that they're selling and they're using celebrity endorsement. And now with social media and its reach and its power, now they don't have to just be satisfied with going after historical figures, but they're actually getting modern day celebrities or pressuring modern day celebrities to endorse them and win over more and more young people. So again, the Black Feminist Revisionist History Project is a major way they've used to make feminism compulsory. And then we can talk briefly about the deal breakers, some of the historical reasons why Black women have not chosen to embrace this term or approach, the history of betrayal at very key moments, the history of discrimination, Eurocentric bias, framing gender as a standalone issue, the lack of an intersectional approach historically, and then the anti-male orientation, excluding men from the movement. And then I want to wrap up with tying it back into some topics or themes that Dr. Brown said. You know, when we look at the fact that 2020 marked the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment passing, and then people celebrating across the nation and saying it gave women the right to vote. When we look at that history more closely, we see that that amendment did not give all women the right to vote. That votes for women did not mean votes for Black women. So Black women are not celebrating 100 years of the right to vote. In fact, we didn't gain access into the Voter Rights Act in 1965. And in this way, that issue is not just a historical issue of something that happened 56 years ago, but it's a current event. It is a current event that in this context today, although we have a record number of women and Black women in Congress, record number of Black people voting, the historic elevation of the vice president, all of those things, but at the same time, it's a current event because of this movement to disenfranchise and take the vote away from Black people. And so I would conclude by saying that when we center Black women, this changes the framework of the narrative, or it should change the framework of the narrative. If we use our own culturally distinct social imperatives to address these questions. And in order to do that, we must stand in our own truth, which begins with decolonizing women's studies, begin decolonizing the conversation about gender, centering Black women, and addressing these questions through our own lens, perspectives, and imperatives. And if we do that, then we do justice to those many ancestors who stood for truth and justice, who fought for Black people, and to change the injustice in this society. We have so many powerful women whose shoulders we stand on. And so we must do our part to tell their story and to tell their truth. I thank you very much for your attention. And I appreciate any questions so that we can have a dialogue. This is the real part of the program that I am looking forward to. I can't hear you.
Let me unmute. Okay. Thank you so much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Watkins. This was wonderful. I think I said to you when we first met to talk about this, that this would be like revival. Okay. And so I really, really do. I'm so excited, and I want to get to the questions now. Ms. Asada Harris is going to read some of the questions that people have placed in the chat box. And so I am going to I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Asada Harris to read a couple of the questions so we can have question and answer. And then after the question and answer session, our chair, Dr. Deara Robertson, is going to close us out with remarks as well, okay? And so thank you. Ms. Harris?
Good afternoon, Dr. Watkins. We actually have a couple of questions for you. Our first would be, how can we tell the stories of Black women in ways that recognize gender issues, but also contextualize the larger struggle of Black communities?
Well, thank you, Ms. Harris. I certainly appreciate you and joining us. So I would say two things. I think, first of all, if we contextualize Black women and their struggles within the context of Black communities. So it's Black women as a part of Black communities are approaching these issues, and they're not isolating gender and gender issues from the larger issues of Black people. So as like you take, for example, the vote, they viewed the vote as the collective property to be used to advance the interests of the community. So they're going to get the vote to get education for their community. They're going to get the vote to stop lynching. They're going to get the vote to stop sexual violence. So it's all interconnected. And then the last thing I would say is I would recommend to people or commend to people a book and a chapter within that book by Neera Sadarkasa. The book is called The Strength of Our Mothers. Mm-hmm. And she has a chapter in there called The Reflection on the Position and Problems of Black Women. And so she actually gives a framework for how to reflect on the position and problems of Black women and connect it to Black people. So I'll break it down in a little formula I came up with, but it's her. It is really her. I call it H squared, C squared. She said, first, whatever issue or problem you identify, put it in historical perspective, put it in historical context. Two, take a systematic or systemic appraisal or evaluation. So you're connecting whatever you're seeing happening to Black women to Black people, because it's not separate. So like when we say her name, when we look at police violence, what is happening to Black women is happening to Black men, is happening to Black people. That's the same with the prison, the explosion of Black people in prison. It's not just the men, it's not just the women, it's our babies that are being tried as adults and put in prison. So you put it in a larger, take a systemic appraisal and see how it affects. It's very related to Black people. And then finally, the C squared, the two C's are complementary and in collaboration. So she said, once you identify those things, then chart a course that is in collaboration with Black men. So again, that's speaking to what St. Pierre Ruffin said, and that is, we're not alienating or withdrawing. We're asking for a coalition of the willing, because our problems are so extensive that we can't just, farm them out. in an isolated way. And finally, complementary. So you're just seeing how everything is corresponding and interconnected. So that is a way we can really truly bring forth Black women's voice. And of course, centering them and saying, what did it mean to them? Not what did other people say it meant, but what did it mean to them?
Thank you so much. We actually have a couple more questions. This one's a three-part question, but it's, why did you start the Women's Studies program here at Bowie State University? What obstacles did you face in getting it started? And was there a Black Women's Studies approach from the conception?
Oh, wow, that's a powerful question. Thank you so much. So it was a team. It wasn't me by myself. We were so lucky. The stars aligned in so many ways because we had at least 4 women professors who had different areas of specializations. So I was Africana Studies, Black women's history, and women's history, and women's studies. And then we had Dr. Walker, who was political science and government. We had Dr. Antozana, who was history, and then we had a professor who was philosophy. So we said we're going to take advantage of all of these specializations, and certainly there was a demand for students who wanted to know more about themselves, particularly the population that is there, Black women who were just excited to have opportunities to learn about themselves. And then the final piece of the puzzle, which is when I say the stars align, this is not something where we had to have a sit-in or a protest. Right. To make it happen. We were lucky to have an administration, and in particular, the leadership of our department that were enthusiastically behind it and supported it. So I was fortunate to be given the opportunity to take a lead role in creating what I call the Women's Studies Strategic Planning and Coordinating Committee, because I realized there were courses being offered across the campus. But in our department, we were able, with our African American history courses, to give Black women a platform, because within the larger field of women's studies, we are not often represented. We're often just add on to other people at the tail end. If you look at some of the syllabus, we're at the end of the syllabus. So what was so unique about Bowie State is that we were able to center Black women in a way to give their voices the representation that it deserved and needed.
I don't believe that there are any more questions. I don't see any more questions in the chat. I think that's all we have for today.
Thank you so much, Ms. Harris. And thank you so much, Ms. Harris. I didn't, let's see, did you say is there another?
We do have another question.
Okay, there's another question.
Okay, is there a way to reconcile the various approaches to Black women's studies?
Yes, if we respect the, we first begin with the premise, no one ideological perspective has a monopoly on truth and insights. So the field will get stronger to be a respectful conversation, allowing the different perspectives to be at the table. This is the dynamic of compulsory feminism that's problematic to me, is that it's an unwillingness to coexist. So I'm not trying to take your feminism from you. I'm just saying you don't have a right to impose it on me, and to impose it as the only perspective within a field. That's the distinction that I'm making, so that if people are in respectful dialogue, the conversation will lead to a stronger field. And that is what is important.
Is that okay? Ms. Harris, did you have any other questions to add?
Yes, we do have one question. We have a couple of questions that have just popped up. The first one being, for those of us who teach history, other than include Black women more, how can we, 1, not treat Black women as an appendage to the history, and 2, avoid the male bias that distorts the history?
Well, it is all in terms of, creating literacy around not just the names and stuff, but how we approach even asking questions. And that's, kind of what we're trying to do with that curriculum. We need a different methodology that allows us to do that complementary approach that we talked about. So I know when we were doing that high school curriculum, we had something called historical pairings, and it was kind of like, well, if you know Martin Luther King, then you should know Ella Baker, and having students research as to why. Or if you know Frederick Douglass, and then you research him, then you should know Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, or Sojourner Truth, or Harriet Tubman. And it wasn't just names, because then it becomes, why should you pair those two together? And you should pair them together because they all were abolitionists. They all were fighting for women having the right to vote. So we could systematically do that. And what is so special about that approach is that that is something unique to our history. Almost every major historical period, wherever you find a prominent man or men, you can find equally prominent women who were side by side in that fight. What happens is that the people of that day or in that organization know, but we haven't done a good job in telling our story. That's why I so commend, what you all are doing today, because I think we're shy about. We're in it for the work. That's what we saw our ancestors do. They just did the work. They didn't sit necessarily, and I'm talking about those who were the activists, write their history. But you know what? We got to do a better job for the next generation, and we do have to tell our stories. So when I appreciate that question that you all had about the start of the department, because I would never be thinking of me I wouldn't even frame it that way, having a pivotal role. And like I said, it was a team. But you're right, we should celebrate it, because they at Maryland may not be, of course, not the first, because if you look at Clark Atlanta University and Dr. Shelby Lewis and Africana Women Studies program, or even Morgan got a program that was earlier than this summer, or what Howard is doing. So, it's pretty treacherous ground to say the first and only. You're just saying, hey, I'm joining the group that have been pushing this in so many ways.
Right. I think we have time for one more question.
We do. We have another question. Are there any resources you can share for young Black women in high school or middle school?
Oh, yes. I don't know what specific area they're interested in. Did they give any sense, or they just said they want some text to read in general? I have a whole stack behind me, but I would say I like the new biographies that are out on Rosa Parks, that are out on Gloria Richardson. So I would do biographies, because that will give you the stories of women. And then if you want some general conversations about history and that kind of stuff, like The Strength of Our Mothers is a very accessible book for a young person, because it's talking about family, so they would like that. And of course, it's talking about mothers, centering mothers in our history. So those are some texts I would recommend. There are a number of there's a new biography on Mary Church Terrell too.
Do we have time for another question? We have one more question in our chat, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. Are there additional books, this is around the same topic, are there additional books and scholarship you can suggest to better inform our students in women's studies in history?
Yes, I like, I do more of the theoretical stuff. So I like The Invention of Women by Oyuranki Oyewumi, which is a very important book to me. And then I would say, I would look up here and say, this book on Black women, Black working wives is a good book to take a look at. Because again, our point of departure when we talk about women didn't work or any, when people have those kind of general stories, you get to see that Black women had a very different history in that. And then finally, for young people, the historical encyclopedia called Black Women in America. Now that will give you a big overview. That's 800 entries. And then depending on how young, if you're going down younger, they have smaller versions. I shouldn't say smaller, for more concise version called Facts on Files, Black Women in America. And it's broken down by like Black women activists, Black women in history and government, Black women in education. That is an excellent resource. Especially you can get used copies, buy them up now, cheap on Amazon before they are totally sold out. But the Facts on File is a great tool resource for young people.
Okay, I think that's all our questions we have today. Thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Harris, and thank you so much again, Dr. Watkins. I'm going to turn it over. Well, I'm just going to put this out there really quick because as you were talking about the different resources and thinking about the questions, Dr. Brown, I was also thinking maybe we have a project here in terms of developing some reading lists, some strategic reading lists. So Dr. Watkins, we got a project here, okay?
Okay, sounds
So
good.
I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Robertson, our chair, and just again, thank you.
Thank you.
It-
On mute. Can everyone hear me?
You,
Yeah, so I just want to extend a special thanks for Dr. Watkins for joining us today and helping us commemorate this Women's History Month and celebrate Women's History program in the Department of History and Government. This event would not be possible without the extreme hard work of Drs. Carmen Walker and Tamara Brown, and as well as our wonderful administrative assistant, Ms. Buck
Yes.
Hurley. And also I'd like to give a special thanks to Ms. Wedderburn and Conference Services.
yes.
And thank Dina Qua for joining us today. Finally, I have to give an extra special thanks to Ms. Asada Harris for doing a wonderful job of moderating this discussion. I was very envious and hope that my daughter could do such a wonderful job one day herself. Thank you. So thanks to everyone, and thanks again, Dr. Watkins.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Watkins.
Thank you.
Well, take care, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very good program. Thank you so much. Yeah, excellent.